By the second spring of her marriage, Innes Westbrook had learned that peace rarely arrived in grand ways. It came in the quiet sounds of a home that had finally become real. The pump handle outside the kitchen window, the low murmur of cattle in the east pasture, the soft creak of the nursery door when the breeze moved through the back hall, the heavier, familiar sound of Harrison's boots before dawn, the warmth of bread rising under a clean towel, the porch boards catching morning light exactly where they should. That porch mattered more to Innes than she often admitted. Years ago, in a stack of letters now long burned, another man had promised her a house with a porch that faced the sunrise. He had promised steadiness, work kindness, and a life she could step into without fear. She had believed him enough to board a train and come west with a trunk, a hat, and the last of her courage. He had not met the train. Now she stood at a kitchen table on the South Range flower, on her hands coffee steaming beside her, and sunlight laying itself across a porch another man had actually built. Not the man who wrote her, the man who stayed. The cradle in the room off the kitchen gave a soft bump against the wall. Innes smiled and crossed into the nursery. Ruth Westbrook, not quite a year old, was awake and studying the bars of her cradle with grave concentration. She had Harrison's dark hair and Innes's habit of looking at the world as if it owed her an explanation before she decided whether to trust it. "Well," Innes said, lifting her, "you look full of judgment this morning." Ruth reached immediately for the collar of her dress. When Innes carried her back into the kitchen, Harrison was coming through the rear door with a split armful of wood across one shoulder. He set it down by the stove and took Ruth without needing to ask. Their daughter went to him as if his arms had always existed for that purpose. "You've been up too long already," he said to Innes. "You've been up just as long." "I was trying not to wake the house. You were failing quietly." That brought the faintest shadow of a smile to one corner of his mouth. Harrison never wasted expression. When he smiled, it felt earned. He sat at the table with Ruth in his lap, while Innes poured coffee. Outside, the South Range opened wide and calm beneath early spring light. The creek ran silver through the pasture. Fence lines stretched cleanly into distance. The new grass near the lower meadow had just begun to show. This was the land Harrison had kept when he and his brother divided the old Westbrook estate after their father died. Not the North Range house, not the family name in its proudest form, but the South Range, with its water rights, its broad working land, and the chance to build something without the bitterness that had once driven him away from it. He had rebuilt the house slowly. He had built the porch himself. He had built the nursery before Ruth was born. He had built a life in the same deliberate way he did most things with quiet hands, and no need to speak before the work was real. "Innes," he said, nodding toward the shelf by the sugar tin. May wrote. She took the letter and opened it. May Hollis's hand was as practical on paper as it was in life. The boarding house roof was still leaking over room 4. Mr. Aldridge remained alive by force of disapproval alone. The butcher had once again miscounted marrow bones, and if the roads were passable in June-May, intended to visit the ranch and decide for herself whether Harrison Westbrook truly deserved the wife he had somehow managed to secure. "That sounds like May," Harrison said. "It does." Innes smiled and folded the letter, but before she could slip it into her apron pocket, Harrison went still. It was a change so slight, most people would have missed it. His shoulders sharpened by a degree. His gaze moved from the cup in his hand to the front window. The room altered around his attention. "What is it?" she asked. He stood. A rider had appeared on the road. Not one of their men. Not a neighbor expected that morning. A single horseman coming from the direction of town at a measured pace, as if he meant to be seen, and did not mind taking his time. Innes crossed halfway into the front room, Ruth now quiet against her shoulder. The rider came nearer, hat brim, dark coat, a straight back in the saddle, hair lighter than Harrison's. Something in her body knew before memory wanted to admit it. No, she thought. But yes. As the horse drew up near the gate, the face lifted clearly enough for recognition to strike without mercy. Gerald Cobb. He dismounted and stood in the yard, looking first at the house, then at the porch, then beyond it toward the barn and the broad sweep of the South Range. Only after that did he look at her. Harrison did not turn away from the window when he asked, "Do you know him?" Innes tightened one hand in Ruth's blanket. "Yes," she said. Her voice did not shake. That surprised her more than the sight of Gerald itself. "Yes, this is the man who never came." The old station platform returned in memory for half a breath wind, waiting the station master's voice, the train pulling away the humiliation of understanding all at once that no one was coming for her. Then the memory passed, because she was not standing on a platform anymore. She was standing in her own house on her own land, with her daughter in her arms and her husband only 2 steps away. Gerald took off his hat. "Innes," he said. And just like that, the peace of mourning was over. Underscore 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 underscore. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hand, as if humility alone might earn him a hearing. Age had not improved him. It had only sharpened the smallness already there. His face was older, narrower, more careful. He still had the kind of looks that passed easily at first glance, the sort that relied on expression rather than substance, in letters that had once been enough to create a man who did not exist. In a ranch yard under daylight, it failed him. "You shouldn't be here," Innes said. "No," Gerald replied. "I suppose I shouldn't." His tone suggested he hoped honesty about the obvious would count in his favor. It did not. Harrison stepped out onto the porch and came down the stairs one board at a time. He did not move fast. He did not need to. Men like Gerald always understood danger better when it arrived quietly. "You can turn around now," Harrison said, "and leave." Gerald looked from him to Innes. "I came to apologize." Innes almost laughed. That was the first surprise. She had imagined long ago that if she ever saw Gerald again, some old hurt would rip open cleanly, and all the shame of that train platform would come rushing back. Instead, she felt something colder and steadier. Disgust, yes. Anger, yes. But not longing for explanation. He had come years too late, even for pain. "You came because you heard where I lived," she said. His eyes flicked to the house and away too quickly. "There are things you deserve to know," he said. "No," Harrison said. "There aren't." Gerald ignored him and addressed Innes, as if Harrison's existence were a temporary inconvenience, rather than the central fact of the yard. "I know what I did. I know there's no excuse. But if you won't hear me as a man asking forgiveness, hear me as someone trying to keep trouble from reaching your door." At that, Harrison's expression changed by 1 hard degree. "My door," he said. Gerald swallowed. The South Range. That settled the matter at once. This was not conscience. This was calculation. He had come and found not the abandoned woman he left behind, but a ranch wife living on desirable land beside a man whose quiet did not conceal weakness at all. Innes saw the truth of him with brutal clarity. Then Gerald Cobb had not returned, because memory had sharpened him into remorse. He had returned because other men had shown him the outline of profit. "What trouble?" she asked. Gerald looked relieved to be asked anything. "A lawyer in Red Hollow, Augustus Purdy, a cattle broker named Edwin Kroll, a few others. They're asking questions about the Westbrook Division, the water rights, the old boundary language, whether this place is secure if pressure is brought in the right places." Harrison took another step toward him. "And how do you know that?" Gerald hesitated. "That tells me enough," Harrison said. "It shouldn't." Gerald snapped, then checked himself and started again. "Purdy talks too freely when he thinks he's among allies." Innes's stomach tightened. "Why would Purdy think you're an ally?" Gerald did not answer immediately. That silence did more damage than any confession could have. Inns understood then that the thread between past and present was real. "What's being said?" she asked, plainly. Gerald finally looked at her directly. "That you came west as a mail-order bride. That the first man didn't have the decency to marry you. That not long after you married Harrison Westbrook, before most of the county knew what the Westbrook name still held in land." He paused. "Some people think that timing looks convenient." For one moment, the whole yard seemed to lose sound. The words themselves did not surprise her. Of course, that was the shape they would choose. Not because it was true, because it was plausible enough to whisper and ugly enough to weaken. It made her old humiliation useful. That was what enraged her. Not the insult alone, the reuse of it. "You came to carry that to my yard?" she asked. "No." Gerald said quickly, "I came to warn you. You came in said because you thought you could stand close to the danger and call yourself necessary." That hit him harder than she expected. Harrison said nothing. He did not need to. He simply took Gerald's horse by the bridle and turned it slightly toward the road. Gerald's voice sharpened. "If you force me out, you'll regret it." Harrison's answer was soft enough that Gerald had to listen carefully. "If you stay," he said, "you'll regret it first." That was enough. Gerald knew the difference between men who threatened to feel strong and men who simply stated the shape of the world as it would soon become. He backed toward the horse. "I'm staying in town, at the hotel." "If you decide you want the truth, I want you gone," Inns said. He looked at her then in a way that finally revealed the one thing she needed to see frustration. Not grief, not guilt. He had expected access. Some door inside her memory that had remained open. He had expected to matter more. He did not. He mounted and rode away. The dust from the road drifted slowly behind him and settled back over the grass. Only then did Harrison turn fully to her. "Are you all right?" Inns looked down at Ruth, who had gone back to resting against her shoulder as if adult failures were none of her concern. "No," Inns said. Then because he deserved truth, but not in the old way. Harrison came back up the porch steps with her. Meaning, she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table. The coffee, the half-risen bread, the letter from May still folded by the sugar tin. "Doesn't feel like being abandoned again," she said. "It feels like watching a man drag his old cowardice to my gate and expect it to become useful." Something in Harrison's face eased, though the anger remained. Inside the kitchen still held warmth. The porch still held sun. The South Range still stretched wide beyond the yard. But the day had changed. Purdy's name was now tied to Gerald's. Her past was now tied to land pressure. And silence, which once protected her dignity, had suddenly become dangerous. Harrison shut the front door. The sound of it closing felt less like fear and more like decision. ________________________ The next morning, Inns rode into Tallow Creek. Harrison had offered to go for her. He had offered in the careful manner of a man trying not to sound as if he wished to forbid the idea entirely. She refused. "If they're using my story," she told him, "I will hear how they tell it." He wanted to argue. She saw it in the set of his mouth. Instead, he said, "Dillard goes with you." That was compromise enough. The town rose out of the road in its usual order hotel porch mercantile church. Steeple hitch rails, dust. Yet Inns entered it differently than she had the first time. Then she had walked into Tallow Creek with a trunk and no one waiting. Now she came as the wife of Harrison Westbrook, with a child at home, a house on the South Range, and no intention of lowering her eyes for anyone. Mrs. Lamb looked up from behind the counter when she entered the mercantile. "Mrs. Westbrook," she said. "Mrs. Lamb." The older woman nodded once, then began collecting lamp oil and sugar without needing the order spoken. Two women stood by the fabric shelf, Viola Penry and Mrs. Haver. Viola had a thin, clever face and the lifelong hunger of women who treat gossip as capital. Mrs. Haver was weaker material, easily impressed, easily led, and always sorry about things only after they turned public. Viola spoke first. Well, she said to no one in particular some women do land better on the second try. The store went still. Inns turned slowly. Viola gave a smile sharp enough to count as a weapon. I wasn't speaking to you. Then say it louder, Inns replied. If it concerns me, I'd rather not have to guess. Mrs. Lamb became very interested in a sack of coffee beans and did not interfere. Viola colored faintly. I only meant it must be comforting to know disappointment can still end in property. There it was. Neat. Cruel. Designed to sound like observation instead of accusation. Inns did not raise her voice. I came to this town because a man invited me and failed me, she said. I stayed because work feeds a woman better than shame, and I married my husband because he was decent before I knew he had anything worth counting. She held Viola's eyes. If that arrangement offends you, the fault is not in mine. A laugh escaped somewhere near the back of the store and died quickly. Viola stiffened. People are talking. Yes, Inns said. And now they will have something true to repeat. That ended it. Not because Viola yielded, but because she had already lost the room. Gossip survives best in side glances. It weakens badly when asked to stand upright. Mrs. Lamb wrapped the sugar and lamp oil and slid them across the counter. Then, in a lower voice, she said, Purdy's been through town twice. Inns looked up sharply, asking after your marriage date, asking after the estate split, asking whether the Westbrook division left legal softness around the river and whether public controversy might help bring matters to a head. Dillard shifted behind her. Who's he been talking to? Inns asked. Gerald. Kroll. One of the bankmen from Red Hollow. Maybe more. Mrs. Lamb folded the cloth with sharp, capable fingers, and he's asking too much for a man who claims to be only clarifying deeds. That was enough to carry elsewhere. From the store, Inns rode directly to May Hollis's boarding house. May opened the door before the second knock. He came here too, she said. Gerald. Yes, come in. The front room smelled of lamp oil stew and old polished wood. Time sat differently in the boarding house. Inns could still feel the shape of the winter she had spent there. The narrow room at the back. The boarding house rhythm the first days of meeting Harrison, when he was still only a wounded stranger, refusing to speak much of himself. May shut the door and folded her arms. What happened at the ranch, Inns told her everything. Gerald at the gate. Purdy's name. The suggestion that her old story was being used. The feeling more than fear that men had found a way to attach legal appetite to emotional scandal. May listened in total silence until Inns finished. Then she said, This isn't gossip. No, it's an argument being prepared. Dillard nodded once. That's how it reads. May sat down at the front room table and pointed for Inns to do the same. Listen carefully, May said. The worst thing Gerald Cobb ever did was not failing to meet your train. Inns frowned. The worst thing he did, May went on, was leave you carrying the question of what his failure said about you. Men like that injure once in action, and then hope the woman will continue the injury in memory. The sentence landed so exactly that Inns could only stare. May leaned in. You are not that girl anymore. You are not the woman standing in my kitchen with 12 cents in a trunk. You are mistress of a ranch wife, to a good man, mother to a child, and the same woman who worked harder in this house than most men who ever paid to sleep here. She paused. If they mean to use your past, then answer from where you stand now, not from where he left you. Something in Inns steadied all at once. What would you do, she asked. May gave her a look. I would drag the matter into church and make every liar hear the truth under the same roof. That sounded exactly like May, and exactly right. When Inns stepped back into the street later, Gerald was standing under the hotel porch, watching, not approaching, measuring. She met his eyes just long enough for him to understand that she had seen him, understood him, and found nothing in him worth a private conversation. Then she mounted and rode back toward the South Range. By the time the ranch came into view, she already knew two things. First, Purdy and Gerald were working in concert with men who wanted leverage over the land. Second, the only clean answer left was a public one. underscore 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 underscore. The warning came 3 nights later. Inez woke because Harrison moved too fast for sleep. Then she smelled it. Smoke. He was already half out of bed. The barn. By the time she reached the front room with Ruth wrapped against her shoulder, the lower hay barn was glowing at one corner like a wound in the dark. Men were shouting in the yard. Horses in the nearest fence line were stamping and blowing. Harrison had the doors open before she reached the porch. "Stay inside," he shouted. Instead, she handed Ruth to Martha and ran for the pump. There was no room for fear at first, only work. Buckets, water, wet cloth, smoke so thick it stung the eyes even outside. The loud crack of a beam heating too fast. The heavier, uglier sound of a structure beginning to fail. They saved the barn by inches. Part of the loft burned through. One side of the roof collapsed. But the main frame held. And when dawn finally reached the yard, it found smoke, ruin mud, and men exhausted enough to lean on their knees. Harrison searched the rear wall once the flames were out. When he called her over, Inez already knew what he had found. The broken neck of a lamp bottle, a blackened strip of rag, greasy with oil. Tracks leading back toward the road, not accident, not carelessness. Message. This wasn't meant to take the whole place, Harrison said, just enough for us to smell how close they can get. That truth angered Inez more than panic would have. By mid-morning, Sheriff Greeley had ridden out from town. He examined the evidence, listened to what Gerald had said at the gate, and asked the necessary questions. "You think Cobb did this?" he asked. "I think Cobb stands close to men who would," Harrison answered. Greeley nodded slowly. "That sounds about right." After he left, the ranch had to go on being a ranch. That was the insult of it. Ruth still needed feeding. Bread still needed baking. Damaged wood still needed moving. Horses still needed calming. Men still needed meals. Work did not excuse itself because evil had come near. By noon, Inez stood in the kitchen doorway watching Harrison direct repairs with soot still at his collar and something in her changed shape. Until then, part of her had still imagined this fight as mostly narrative gossip, accusation, legal pressure, old shame reused. The barn fire ended that illusion. These men were willing to let fear into a family's walls. That meant the answer could no longer be cautious. When Dillard rode back from Red Hollow that evening, he confirmed what Harrison already suspected. Purdy had been seen with Gerald and Edwin Kroll. Draft language was circulating around marital motive, public irregularity, and estate clarification. In polite language, men were trying to say the same ugly thing Viola Penry had already said at the Mercantile, that perhaps Inez Westbrook had not been a rejected bride who found love, but an opportunist who found a better property. May Hollis arrived before supper. She stepped down from her wagon, took one look at the barn, and said, "I see the county has chosen foolishness again." Inez laughed despite everything. That alone told her how glad she was May had come. Inside over coffee, May listened to Dillard's report and said, "Then Sunday." No one asked what she meant. "In church," May said, "before the whole town. If they mean to make her life public, then she answers where everyone can hear." Harrison looked at Inez. She met his eyes and said, "Yes." He nodded once. The decision once spoken aloud made the fear smaller. Not gone. Never gone. But smaller. Because there is a kind of fear that feeds on uncertainty, and another that dies the moment a woman chooses her answer. That night after Ruth was asleep and the ranch had gone quiet, Harrison found Inez on the porch. "You don't have to do this," he said. "Yes," she replied. "I do." He stood beside her. "Then I stand with you." That was never in doubt. He put one hand over hers on the railing. "I wanted it set." The moon rose over the lower pasture, pale over the smoke-dark roofline of the barn. Inside the house, everything ordinary still waited: lamp oil, folded linens, a sleeping child bred for morning. Outside, the whole ranch seemed to hold itself still around their decision. Sunday would not repair the barn. It would not stop Purdy from filing papers. It would not make Gerald honest or Kroll decent. But it would do one necessary thing. It would take her story back. Underscore, 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 underscore. Sunday came bright and hard, the kind of day that made hiding feel foolish. NZ dressed with more care than vanity. A plain dark gray dress, high collar, no ornament beyond her wedding ring. Harrison said little while they drove into town, but his silence was the silence of full attention, not distance. Gerald was already in church when they arrived. Purdy sat beside him. That sight alone nearly made Inns laugh. Both men had dressed as if respectability were a clean shirt one could simply button over corruption. Reverend Pike preached on stewardship. That, too, might have been funny if the hour had not mattered so much. When the final hymn ended, and the congregation began to gather itself for dismissal, Harrison rose. Then Inns rose. "Reverend," she said clearly, "before anyone leaves, I ask permission to speak." The room froze. Reverend Pike blinked behind his spectacles. "Mrs. Westbrook, my life has already been discussed publicly," she said. "I would prefer to answer publicly." After a brief pause, the minister nodded. "You may." Inns stepped into the aisle and turned. Faces looked back at her in every direction. Curious, guilty-hungry, embarrassed, loyal-afraid. "Tallow Creek under one roof. Most of you know some piece of my story," she began. "But lately, that story has been told in ways that serve other people better than they serve the truth. So I will tell it myself." No one moved. "Years ago, a man named Gerald Cobb wrote to me and promised marriage, home, and decency. He sent me a train ticket west. He did not meet that train. He did not leave word. He did not explain. He abandoned me in this town before I had even set my feet properly on its platform." A rustle moved through the pews. "I found work here. Some of you know that because you ate at May Hollis's boarding house, slept in rooms I cleaned and drank coffee I served. I made an honest life in Tallow Creek before I ever knew Harrison Westbrook's full name. That changed the room already. Memories are stronger than rumor when people are forced to choose." Later, she continued, "My husband was brought to that same boarding house wounded. I cared for him because he was hurt. At the time, I believed him to be only what he seemed, a quiet, stubborn man, with pain in his side and more honesty in him than most people bring into a room. That was enough for me." Her voice strengthened. "By the time I learned the size of his inheritance, I had already learned the size of his character." Now she looked directly at Gerald. "If any person here wishes to say I married for land, they must also believe I possessed the genius to nurse a stranger on the chance he would prove wealthy later. If that is your belief, then you credit me with a strategy I do not have." A few startled laughs broke loose despite the tension. Inns did not smile. "I married Harrison Westbrook because he returned when he said he would. Because he told the truth when it cost him comfort. Because he built a home and asked me to stand in it with him. And the man who once failed to meet my train does not get to ride back into my life, now that it is good, and call himself warning help or witness." Gerald rose. "I came to tell the truth." "No," Ince said. "You came because there was profit in old injury." Purdy stood too. "This is becoming emotional." That was when Elias Westbrook laughed from the back pew. A hard, short sound. "Say plain what you mean," Counselor Elias called. "You hoped gossip about my brother's wife would make the South Range easier to pressure." Purdy flushed. "That is not an accurate legal reduction." Then Harrison stood. If the room had been quiet before now, it became silent in a different way. "If you have business with my land," he said, "bring it to me directly and lawfully. If you have questions about my marriage, ask yourself why a woman's old humiliation is the only tool you found worth using." Mrs. Lamb rose 2 pews over. Mrs. Westbrook worked harder in this town than half the people discussing her, she said. Mr. Westbrook has never cheated a bill or a hand. If anyone objects to their marriage, perhaps the objection lies elsewhere. Then from the doorway, May Hollis spoke. She fed half the people in this room, May said. The other half could stand to be spoken to more. If anybody means to imply she hunted a ranch, they can explain why she spent 6 weeks scrubbing my floors before she ever knew Harrison Westbrook had more than one decent shirt. That finished it. Not formally, but morally. The room turned. Gerald tried one last time. It's still true. Men are coming for that ranch, he said. Whether you like me or not. Sheriff Greeley near the side aisle answered before anyone else. Then perhaps those men should stop borrowing cowards to speak for them. No one moved toward Gerald after that. No one moved toward Purdy. They moved toward Inns. Mrs. Lamb. 2 older women from the sewing circle. A shy ranch wife who only touched Inns's sleeve and whispered, "Good." Outside in the churchyard, the crowd broke into clusters. Greeley intercepted Purdy before he could leave cleanly. Elias stood beside Harrison. Dillard stood near enough to make movement unwise. Gerald approached once with his hat in his hand. "Inns," he said. She looked at him. "I did care for you." "No," she answered. "You cared for the version of yourself you liked inside my letters. That was never the same thing." He looked stricken not by loss, but by accuracy. "In the life I have now," she said, "your apology has no use." That ended him. He walked away under open daylight, and for the first time since the station platform years ago, Inns felt the shame lift cleanly from her body. Not disappear. Return. To where it had belonged all along. Underscore, 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 underscore. Church ended the town side of the attack. It did not end the legal side. By Tuesday, Dillard rode in from Red Hollow with word that Purdy had shifted from whisper to paperwork. He was drafting narrow challenges around the river, crossing grazing access and old language in Daniel Westbrook's division papers. He no longer needed people to like his version of events. He only needed them to believe enough trouble existed that Harrison and Elias might give ground to avoid expense. The kitchen table disappeared under maps and letters. Elias rode down from the North Range and spread out old survey lines with his usual impatience. Harrison laid down copies of the division agreement. Dillard reported on bankmen Kroll and one clerk in Red Hollow willing to admit that Purdy had been circling like a man who smelled leverage. "We need older records," Harrison said. "Something from Father's time. Something showing what was intended with the river language." Elias rubbed his jaw. Could be in the North Range desk. Could be in Mercer's old files if his son kept anything. Could be nowhere. May, stirring coffee on the stove, said, "Then quit discussing possibility and go fetch certainty." So they split the work. Elias and Dillard would ride to the North Range house and search Daniel's desk trunks and office ledgers. Harrison would go to Red Hollow to see Judge Mercer's son and the county records office. Greeley would continue leaning on Gerald. Inns would remain at the South Range, no, she said. Harrison looked up immediately. Inns, no. He set down the pencil. The barn was set on fire less than a week ago, and if I sit quietly at home while you search old records, does that make me safer? It keeps you here. It keeps me ignorant. May stopped moving at the stove. Then she crossed the room, opened the sideboard drawer, and pulled out one folded paper. Inns stared. "What is that?" "One of Gerald's letters." "I thought I burned them." "You thought you did." May gave a brief shrug. "I burned most. I kept one page because his handwriting looked slippery." Harrison unfolded it carefully. It was the page about the porch facing the morning sun, the proper kitchen, the house he never built. Then at the bottom margin in smaller writing, Send reply to the Red Hollow office. Mr. Purdy can hold correspondence if I'm away on business. Silence filled the room. Purdy. Not just now. Then. Elias leaned forward. He clerked in his uncle's office in those years. Dillard swore softly. May folded her arms. So the snake knew him before any of us did. That changed everything. This was no longer merely present greed using an old story. There was a direct line from Purdy to Gerald, and from Gerald back to the letters that brought Inns West in the first place. Harrison folded the page and slipped it into his coat. I leave at first light. He did. Elias and Dillard rode north. Harrison rode east to Red Hollow. The day stretched long without them. Inns filled it as best she could. Bread, mending, Ruth's nap, the ordinary tasks that keep a house from becoming too available to fear. Yet beneath every chore ran the same hard thought: if Purdy had been attached to Gerald from the beginning, then whatever present legal posture he claimed was built over rot. Late in the afternoon, Elias returned from the North Range with a mud-spattered dispatch box, 2 survey notebooks, and an old letter from Judge Mercer to Daniel Westbrook. They opened the dispatch box at the kitchen table. Inside were tax receipts, boundary notes, 2 letters from lenders, and Mercer's warning never trust Augustus Purdy with family papers, as the young man's discretion in matters of matrimonial correspondence and temporary inducement had already proved dangerously weak. May made a harsh, satisfied sound. There. An hour later, Harrison came home. He looked worn raw by road and concentration, but when he stepped through the kitchen door and saw Inns, his face changed. "You found it," she said. "Yes." From his coat, he produced copies from an old district receiving ledger. Several entries showed letters addressed to Gerald Cobb, care of the Red Hollow office during the exact months Inns had been corresponding with him. One note in Purdy's own hand authorized temporary forwarding, and mentioned anticipated domestic complication should the bride arrive before funds are settled. Then came the payment record. Cash disbursed from Edwin Kroll to Gerald Cobb. Same week, same office. For a long time no one spoke. Then Inns said very quietly, "Before I even boarded the train, they had already made a trade of me." No one contradicted her. There was nothing left to contradict. Underscore 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 underscore. The discovery in Red Hollow should have ended the practical fight quickly. It did not. Desperate men seldom retreat cleanly when first cornered. They lash out once more in the place they believe a family feels most vulnerable. 2 nights after Harrison returned with the records, Inns woke to the sound of something at the nursery window. Not a loud sound, not breaking glass, a faint scrape. She sat up at once. Harrison was already moving. This time there was no smell of fire. No shouted warning, only the kind of silence that makes every small sound larger. He crossed the room, took up the rifle from beside the wardrobe, and held one hand toward her without looking back. "Stay." Instead, Inns went for Ruth. By the time Harrison reached the hall, Dillard, who had taken to sleeping in the bunk room near the stable since the barn fire, was already outside with a lantern. Voices rose in the yard. One of the dogs began barking near the kitchen garden. Then came the sound of running feet and a man cursing low in the dark. Harrison went out the back. Inns stayed in the nursery with Ruth against her chest, heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. May appeared in the doorway a second later, wearing a shawl and no patience at all. "What is it, someone outside?" May's face hardened. "Of course there is." They waited. It felt much longer than it was. At last, Harrison came back in lantern light behind him, Dillard following close. Both men looked furious. "What happened?" Inns asked. Harrison set the rifle aside and came straight to her. Someone tried the office window. The ranch office sat just beyond the kitchen, where Harrison kept deed copies, bank notes, and the working accounts. After Red Hollow, every important paper had been brought under this roof. "Did you catch him?" Dillard answered. "No. He got the hedge fence and found his horse. But I'd know the build again." Harrison said he wasn't after money. No one needed telling what he had been after. The papers, the records from Mercer and Red Hollow, the proof tying Purdy to Gerald from the beginning, the evidence that made their whole current scheme poisonous. May let out one sharp curse. Innes looked from Harrison to the office door and understood something at once. This was no longer just Gerald attaching himself to trouble. Someone else had decided the records mattered enough to risk a nighttime attempt. Kroll, she asked. Maybe Harrison said. Or someone he hired. Or Purdy's last useful fool. Dillard held up something between two fingers. A torn strip of cloth. Dark broadcloth expensive enough not to belong to a common ranch hand, ripped on the hedge wire near the office window. May took one look and said, "That's not the kind of coat a man wears to muck stalls." No, it wasn't. Harrison crossed the room and checked the office box. The papers were still there. Innes stood in the nursery doorway with Ruth against her and realized with cold clarity that the fight had reached its final edge. The church had taken the moral ground. Red Hollow had taken the paper ground. Now the men behind it were trying to recover what could still be stolen by force or stealth. They had touched the family's walls. That changed something in Harrison, too. She could see it in him. Until now, his anger had been controlled, deliberate, strategic. It remained all those things. But there was something darker in it now, because someone had come close enough to the nursery window for his wife to hear it in the dark. The next morning he rode to town before sunrise. He returned with Sheriff Greeley, who examined the office window, the hedge line, the torn cloth, and the fresh hoof prints beyond the east side of the yard. Hotel tailor cloth. Greeley said of the broadcloth strip, or better, not local work gear. That narrows the list, Elias said, having arrived from the North Range just after dawn. Greeley turned to Harrison. "I can search Gerald's room with cause enough now if he's still fool enough to keep anything." "Do it," Harrison said. By noon, they had their answer. Gerald's room at the hotel contained one matching coat with a torn section at the hem and mud on the lower edge that matched the east hedge line. More importantly, it contained a note in Purdy's hand instructing Gerald to see whether the widow's friend or the Westbrook woman keeps the copied records in the house yet. The widow's friend could only mean May Hollis. The Westbrook woman meant Innes. Greeley came straight from the hotel to the ranch with the note. He laid it on the kitchen table. No one touched it at first. The room was very quiet. Then Innes said, "He came to the nursery window." Harrison looked at her. Not because he hadn't understood already, because hearing her say it aloud gave the fact its final shape. "He did," he answered. For one long moment no one spoke. Then Harrison turned to Greeley and said in a voice so calm it chilled everyone who heard it, "Finish him." Greeley nodded. "I intend to." That afternoon, Gerald Cobb was arrested formally on false witness language, attempted unlawful entry, related to evidentiary interference, and whatever else Greeley and Mercer's people in Red Hollow could fit around the truth. When the deputy wagon took him out, half the town watched. Innes did not. She stood in the nursery and looked at Ruth's sleeping face and understood more clearly than ever before what this had all become. No longer a story about an abandoned bride. No longer a story about rumor. Not even a story about land. A story about whether old betrayal could be allowed near the next generation. Her answer now and forever was no. Underscore 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 underscore. Gerald talked once he realized the alternative was being left to Kroll. and Purdy's silence without any chance to reduce his own punishment. He did not become noble. He became frightened. Sometimes that was enough. Sheriff Greeley brought the Fuller statement to the South Range 2 days later. Harrison, Innsmay, Elias, and Dillard gathered at the kitchen table again as they had gathered for nearly every turn in the fight. The statement was uglier than the first. Gerald admitted Purdy had known from the beginning that he was corresponding with women under false pretenses. Admitted the Red Hollow office had been used to manage letters delays and disappearances when those correspondences grew inconvenient. Admitted Edwin Kroll paid him to vanish before Inns's train arrived because Kroll feared domestic complication from women connected to men he was using in wider landside arrangements. There had been others, other letters, other women, other promises made cheaply. Gerald admitted he returned to Tallow Creek only after hearing that Inns had married Harrison Westbrook of the South Range, and that Purdy believed old public scandal could help weaken the household if legal pressure was applied at the same time. He admitted the nighttime attempt on the office window as well, not in heroic detail, in cowardly detail. He said Purdy's last letter had pressed him. Kroll wanted the copied records gone, or at least delayed. Gerald thought if he could get the papers, he might bargain for leniency later. At that, May nearly threw the coffee pot. He was always willing to sell the same woman twice, she said. No one disagreed. Greeley also brought the final piece. Kroll had withdrawn completely and was cooperating just enough to keep his own neck from the noose. Purdy, hearing the shape of Gerald's confession, had sent word through counsel that he was willing to abandon all present action against the South Range and the North Range if the county chose not to pursue broader fraud charges across state lines. Elias laughed once bitterly. So now he discovers reason. Harrison asked, "Do they have enough to ruin him?" Greeley said. "Maybe not enough to bury him forever, but enough that he'll never handle a respectable land matter in this district again. That was justice of a frontier kind. Not perfect, not poetic, but permanent enough to matter." After Greeley left, Elias remained at the table longer than usual. At last he cleared his throat. "I owe you both more than I said the other day." Inns looked up. He turned first to Harrison. "After Father died, I told myself you walked away because you lacked stomach for the fight. It took all this for me to admit I may have been angriest, because you had the sense to leave before grief turned everything in that house rotten." He stopped, uncomfortable with his own honesty. "I should have come after you sooner. As a brother." Harrison said nothing for a moment. Then, "Maybe, but you came now." Elias nodded once, as if accepting partial absolution with annoyance. Then he faced Inns. "When I first heard the story about the station, I was suspicious. I thought maybe the timing of your marriage and what little I knew of your past looked convenient." He grimaced. "I was wrong. Entirely." Inns held his gaze. "Yes," she said. He almost smiled at that. May, without looking up from her sewing, said, "This family is making dangerous progress." Dillard gave one quiet laugh. The room softened around that. Not into ease exactly. Into honesty. Later that evening, after Elias had gone to the stable and May had taken Ruth to the back room, Harrison found Inns standing by the office window. The papers were back in their box now. The threat against them had shifted from immediate to historical, yet she still looked at the latch with the memory of that scraping sound in the dark. He came up behind her slowly. "It's done," he said. She nodded. "I know." He waited. Then she turned and said, "Do you know the strangest part? What I am less wounded now than before we found the full truth." He listened without interrupting. "For years," she said, "some part of me still made that station platform personal. I knew he failed. I knew he lied. But in some buried place, I still thought there must have been a moment where he looked at the thought of me and decided I was simple to leave." Harrison's face tightened slightly. "Now," she continued, "I know there never was such a moment. There was only money convenience and a man too weak to care what he turned into profit." She let out a breath. "It does not make the wrong smaller, but it makes it stop pretending to be about my worth." He stepped closer and took both her hands. "It never was," he said. "No," she answered. Now I know." He kissed her forehead. The office window still faced the yard. The nursery still stood across the hall. The papers still lay in the box. But the meaning of them had changed. The whole confession had done what confession sometimes does at its best. It had moved blame cleanly out of the woman who carried it and back into the men who built it. Underscore 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 underscore. Peace did not return in a single day. It returned in ordinary proofs. No more strange riders at the gate. No more smoke in the night. No more whispers carried into town before a woman had the chance to answer them herself. By the end of the month, Purdy had formally withdrawn every challenge tied to the South Range and North Range boundary dispute. Kroll publicly abandoned any claim of interest in clarification of local holdings. Gerald was gone from the county, and according to Sheriff Greeley, unlikely to reappear anywhere west of Red Hollow, where his name was still fresh. The ranch resumed itself. That mattered more than any punishment. Men repaired the last of the barn roof. Spring calves thickened in the pasture. Martha scolded Ruth for trying to put pebbles into her mouth, while secretly adoring her. May remained longer than anyone expected, claiming Tallow Creek would only ruin itself in her absence and might benefit from the exercise. One evening, Elias stayed for supper and lingered on the porch afterward. The sky had gone deep blue. The first stars were out above the eastern ridge. Harrison leaned on the railing. Innes sat in the porch chair with Ruth asleep against her shoulder. Elias took off his hat, turned it once in his hands and said, "For what it's worth, Father would have liked her." Harrison looked at him. "You talking about my wife or my daughter?" Elias glanced at Ruth. Both. But the wife first. It was a rough offering, but a real one. Innes smiled. "I'll accept that on behalf of the household." He nodded and left soon after riding north under moonlight with less hardness in him than he had carried before. When the yard finally went quiet, Harrison came and crouched beside Innes's chair so he could look at Ruth sleeping. "She drools like a ranch hand," he said softly. "That's your side of the family." He looked up at her then. "How are you truly?" The question deserved a true answer. She thought for a while before speaking. "Tired," she said first. He almost smiled. "That I could have guessed." And lighter. Her fingers traced one of Ruth's curls. "The strangest thing is that I don't think about Gerald the way I did before he returned. How do you think about him now?" "As a man who failed," she said. "Not as a man who defined anything." That pleased him. She saw it. He stood and took Ruth from her so she could stretch her arms. The sight of him holding their sleeping daughter in porch light made something in Innes settle even deeper. There had once been a winter when she believed safety was only what people wrote in letters. Then she learned it was work. Then she learned it was witness. Then she learned it was truth, spoken aloud. Finally, here she learned it could also be a man holding a child in one arm while checking the porch latch with the other. "Harrison," she said. He looked back. "There's one thing I haven't asked. What if Gerald had managed to get the papers? If the fire had spread? If this had gone worse?" He came back to stand in front of her. "It didn't." "I know. But if it had?" His expression changed not into anger, but into that deeper thing that lived underneath it whenever family was involved. "Then I would still have stood where I'm standing," he said, and dealt with what came next. The simplicity of that nearly undid her. Some men spoke of protection the way others spoke of storms loudly, as if volume made shelter. Harrison never had. He simply remained where shelter was required. She reached for his free hand. "You know," she said quietly when I stood on that station platform, "I thought the worst thing a woman could learn was that no one was coming." His fingers closed around hers. "And now I think the worst thing is believing that once too long." He said nothing. He did not need to. Because Ruth was in his arms. Because the house stood behind them. Because the porch faced east. because no rider waited on the road, because every necessary answer had already been given. At last, she said, "The shame belongs to him now." "Yes," Harrison answered. And that was the final movement of the story. Not the arrest, not the records, not even the public victory in church. This. A woman finally returning shame to its rightful owner. Underscore 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 by the next spring. The worst of it had begun to feel far enough away that Inns could look at the porch in sunrise and think first of light knot letters. That alone felt like healing. The South Range had settled into a rhythm broad enough to hold everything that had happened without being ruled by it. The rebuilt barn stood strong. The river ran fuller after winter snowmelt. Ruth had gone from cautious steps to determined running, and now moved through the house as if command belonged naturally to her. May visited twice and stayed too long both times, which meant exactly as long as she intended. Elias rode down more often from the North Range and argued with Harrison now about cattle prices and fence line repair instead of old family hurt. Life had not become easier in a foolish way. It had simply become theirs. One clear morning, Inns stood on the porch with a cup of coffee in her hands and watched Harrison in the yard below. He was fitting a new latch to the south gate, while Ruth toddled after him with a wooden spoon she had mistaken for authority. Dillard leaned on the fence nearby, pretending not to laugh every time the child issued some grave nonsense instruction to her father. "She means to run the place," May said from the doorway behind Inns. "She may, as long as she starts with the men. They're easier to train young." Inns laughed. May came to stand beside her and looked out over the ranch. He looked settled. He did. There was once a stillness in Harrison that had belonged partly to pain and partly to distance, as if he had stepped outside his own name and was uncertain whether he meant ever to live fully inside it again. That stillness remained, but it had changed. Now it looked like rootedness. "So do you," May added. Inns looked toward the eastern ridge where dawn had first touched the porch boards every morning since Harrison built them. How strange she thought that something once promised in a lie had become real in truth. Not because fate had been kind, because the right man had put his hands to timber and made a life instead of a speech. "I think I am," she said. Later that afternoon, when the house grew quiet for an hour and Ruth finally slept, Inns sat at the small writing desk by the front window. She had begun writing more over the past year. Not because she meant to become a writer, because words had once failed her so badly from other people's mouths that putting her own in order felt like a way of restoring something. She took out a clean sheet of paper. No address, no formal opening. She wrote only this: "You were not easy to leave. He was easy to fail. It took time to learn the difference. But the porch faces the morning sun after all." She folded the note and placed it in the desk drawer. It was not for Gerald, not for Harrison, not even for May. It was for the woman she had once been. The one on the station platform. The one who mistook abandonment for verdict. The one who needed at last to be answered. That evening, Harrison found her on the porch again. The sky had gone gold over the lower pasture. A lamp glowed in the nursery behind them. The smell of supper still drifted from the kitchen. "I've been thinking," he said. She smiled faintly. "That sounds serious." "It may be." He leaned one shoulder against the post. "Ruth will need a larger room soon. That is the trouble with children." "Yes." A pause. "I thought maybe we could build onto the back. Another room. Or two." She turned toward him. "Two." He met her eyes then, and some softness entered his face she loved more every time she saw it. "One for Ruth," he said, "and one because I was hoping you might want another child." For a moment, the whole evening seemed to go still around them. Not because the world paused, because love did what it always does at its best. It made ordinary sentences feel like doors opening. Inns looked at him, at the man who had once arrived at a boarding house, wounded and hidden from himself, at the husband who stood beside her in church, at the father who could calm Ruth with one look, at the rancher who built instead of boasting, at the man who, without ever saying it, theatrically had returned every time he promised he would. "Yes," she said softly, "I would." Relief crossed his face first, then joy. "Good," he said. "That's all I had more prepared. It seems to have left." She laughed and stepped into him. He held her there in the last light while the South Range spread broad and calm beyond the porch, and Inns understood perhaps more fully than ever before what the real ending of the story had been. Not Gerald's disgrace, not Purdy's collapse, not Kroll's retreat. The real ending was this. A woman once left standing alone, now standing in her own doorway. A man once separated from his home, now rooted fully inside it. A child asleep in the next room. Another, perhaps waiting in the future. And a porch facing the morning sun, not as a promise in a letter, but as a fact, built in wood and lived in truth. They stayed there until the last light drained from the fields and the first stars came out over the ridge. Then they went inside together,